As an introduction, my name is Samantha Torrance. I lead the Policy Implementation Access Partnership, and within that, the Emerging Markets practice. So I'm very pleased that our event today has taken, emerging markets as a general theme. I think it's really important that we remember that there is a rest of the world, and when we're talking about tech, it's not just the US, the EU, and London, or the UK as such. So I have the pleasure of moderating the session today on content moderation. So looking at how we can further policy discussions in culturally, religiously, and geographically dispersed, geographically differentiated regions. I'll introduce our panel, which represents broad stakeholder groups within this policy area and within the tech sector in general. So to my immediate right, Onika Makwakwa. She's already asked some very interesting questions today in our session, but the Executive Director of the Global Digital Inclusion Partnership. She's an active consumer, civil, and digital rights advocate, and she currently leads the Africa Summit for Women and Girls in Technology. Her career has taken her across the continents, and I learned last night that she spent a good 20 years in Washington, D.C., and now is based in Johannesburg. So thank you very much for making the trip here today. Thank you. At the end of our seating here, we have Saad Mustafa, who is a manager at Google, based in London. He works on regulatory affairs and the content policy team, or works within the content policy team. So obviously, brings that industry insight that we're always looking for. Prior to his career at Google, he worked at Ofcom, again on consumer rights within the telecom sector, but also on content moderation. And prior to that, at Ofgem, interestingly. So a regulator at heart, perhaps, that has crossed the aisle. Interesting. And then last but not least is Nada Ihab, our centre participant here. Nada is a senior manager within the Middle East and North Africa team, so she works quite closely with me on a number of the issues that we work on behalf of our clients. She's a policy analyst and an ardent problem solver. She supports companies to navigate complex regulatory roadblocks and environments in the Middle East, but also increasingly in Africa more generally, and also within LATAM. She's passionate about the tech policy debate, and particularly the role of government and the role that government has to play in that intersection with the private sector. And prior to Access Partnership, Nada worked at Microsoft. So, welcome to the panel. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So I have the pleasure of moderating a contentious session, and as we already heard, it's not being broadcast, which I think is maybe a good thing in light of the individual attacks that some people can face when they are creating and distributing content on social media networks. But I want to talk about the policy environment and how we can support better outcomes when it comes to content moderation. And actually, in preparation for this session, I typed in, a very popular search engine, what is content moderation? And it was very interesting to see, and maybe not that surprising, that there isn't one definition of it. And not just at a multilateral or an institutional level, but also at a company level, how people interpret, or how companies and the industry and various industries interpret the topic. So it was an interesting starting point. But I think fundamentally there's an agreement and some consensus on various aspects related to content that we don't really argue about, and we're very clear on, related to child protection, subjects around terrorism, etc. But increasingly we're focusing now on fake news, misinformation, hate speech, or what constitutes hate speech, and there's certainly a lot less consensus around those subject matters. And that's effectively where I'd like to start our conversation today. What does good policy look like when we're talking about content moderation within this dynamic in particular? Maybe Nada, start with you.
Sure, thank you so much, Samantha, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here with all of you. I think the short answer is it's very difficult to give a one-size-fits-all policy perfect draft, right? It's a question of governments attempting to build their own regulatory toolbox, which would include different policies, guidelines, but the essential elements of that toolbox need to be around clear definitions of what is illegal, what is harmful, and why. From a government perspective, I think that should include, regular stakeholder engagement. The definition of what is harmful content definitely changes with, more and more services and increasing parts of our lives being, digital and available in the online space. I think, content moderation rules in this toolbox, when it's, applied or implemented, it needs to be proportionate. It needs to be transparent, and there always has to be a process in place for individuals to dispute any kind of decision that's being made on their account. From a private sector perspective, there's always a balancing act between, private sector and government, and I think private sector, as we'll probably explore in this session today, has a very important role to play. And again, transparency is a key feature here, where we need to understand from each platform's perspective what's being taken down, and the transparency reports are items or not items, they are collateral that incite user trust, and they do build user confidence on platforms. But I also think the private sector needs to engage with civil society groups, governments, to understand how their community guidelines and how their transparency reports are being used, interpreted, and how do they sit, within each market where their products and services are being used on a daily basis. So I don't think we can reach uniformity. I think it's a tightrope walk where, we're balancing between strict government policies and regulations or self-regulations by private sector, and we need to just continuously walk together and engage in dialogue as we do that, so we can fine-tune our tools, improve them, maybe swap them for something else. And I think, as we'll explore again in today's session, there's a lot going on in the EU-UK front, but I think no one in this room has an answer. I don't think a single organization or government has found the solution to content moderation, like the perfect match and the perfect balance. So I think we should all, be in a mindset to continuously learn from one another, from between the private sector and governments. Users being able to feed into these dialogues directly is a good starting point.
Great. Annika, your perspectives from where you sit, from the user and the consumer protection side.
Yes, so I think I would lean a lot more on this idea of transparency. Because what we have at the moment is a serious trust deficit between users and platform operators as well as government. In fact, all the sectors, no one seems to be trusting the other. And so it makes transparency really important. But at the moment, content moderation is very contentious. So I don't think you can have a one-size-fits-all policy. But one thing that's critical in any policy that we set, especially around content moderation, is going to be this notion of being able to be consultative in how we are developing the policy. But not just only consultative, and when we are consultative, we have to make sure that we are consulting across the different diversities that are being serviced there. And I'll give you just an example. I mean, I think, we have some general agreement around child protection, for example. But one area that we have not had general agreement on, but it actually has an impact on our digital connectivity goals and development, is the issue of safety for women in particular. I mean, we are beginning to see online gender-based violence that feels a lot more like fake news because it's actually gendered disinformation, where women who are vocal online, mostly politicians, sometimes journalists, women who speak their mind online, basically trolled because, through gender disinformation that's basically informed by patriarchy and a form of silencing them. So how do we balance that, moderating that type of content against freedom of speech? right? And that's what we come across a lot. So it's really important that when we are doing this policy reform on content moderation, that we are consultative in a way that makes sure that those voices are also considered and in the room to be able to help us inform and better shape what content moderation will look like. The disinformation, the gender disinformation in particular, has a very disparate impact on young girls. And that's the future that we talk about in digital future. Because young girls today are growing up seeing their mothers being dragged online and having stereotypes being reinforced about women as gold diggers, and as an example. And they're actually learning, in fact, there's a research that was done by Plan International, I think, where they interviewed a number of girls, and they're self-censoring themselves now. So imagine all the development investments we've made to get girls to, be confident, to get educated, to be assertive, only for us to reverse that because we are allowing online spaces that are violent and, have so much vitriol against existing as a woman, and especially as a woman who is confident and who is assertive, who speaks her mind. So for me, I think those policies cannot be just looking at digital platforms alone. We have to look at them holistically with our policies around equality. A lot of us have constitutions that talk about gender equality, and that should not be looked at in isolation, because the discrimination that we see online, whether it's hate speech against certain races or against certain genders, it's not unique to online. It's actually replicated from society itself. So we cannot look at it only from a digital lens. I think it's really important for us to have a comprehensive conversation that's multi-sectoral and involves everyone in a consultative state around what is acceptable in terms of moderation of the content that's happening online. But most importantly, keeping the issue of safety, that we are investing in digital development, yet we are allowing things that actually sabotage that investment, leading us to having a user gap. I think there's less, for every 2 women that are online now, there's about 3 men who are online. And this is just across, it's not just the developing world only, but we've created this digital gender disparity that is unfortunately actually growing in the developing world, especially, that we have to be conscious and intentional about closing.
You raise a number of very good points there, but there's 2 commonalities in terms of what the 3 of you have presented in the sense of transparency of whatever rules are in place, so that everybody, has, it's a level playing field, so to speak, on that front. But also the ongoing challenge of navigating this tightrope between, protecting free speech, but also moderating content and ensuring that there is safety online. So that, to me, speaks as an obvious place for government intervention, in the sense of that is the role of regulators. So we've seen, and we are increasingly seeing, regulation within this environment. The EU has passed recently the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act as well. The UK is just about to pass the Online Safety Bill. When we're talking about these subject matters from an emerging markets or a developing country perspective, do you think that these legislative developments are useful in that discussion? Do they provide a useful frame, or do they obfuscate the discussion that needs to happen?
So, I think that it's important for these to be localized as well, so, and I like the fact that you use the term framework. It's a good starting point. I think what we've seen, especially even on the cyber crimes front, where there's a lot of copy and paste across globally. Actually, I don't think any country is, clean on that, but there's a lot of copy and paste. But local context is really important. And I'll give you an example of using South Africa. When you look at South Africa in terms of who is being discriminated against from a racial perspective, it's so nuanced in the history and the present of the country that you can't just copy and paste what has come from one region to another. So I think it's really important that we look at local context and how it will work in this issue of content. But also what we've tended to see is content moderation that tends to put a lot of onus also on the users as well. We need content moderation and some of these protections that we need to be built into the platforms. At some point, we have to demand that the platform designers design with safety in mind, so that we are not burdening victims online to have to be responsible for protecting themselves as well. And it's not impossible. I mean, we've seen companies like Bumble, for example, really take a clear stand to design for safety. So if we can have more policies and laws that really also push the responsibility on the innovators of these platforms to make sure that they are also safe, and then add that to the transparency around when you are on a site. These are the rules. I mean, I always marvel at this notion of these are the community rules. Who is the community and what was their role in setting the rules?
Sure.
Most of the time we have not demanded that from the big platforms to make sure that the community is actually the ones who are developing the rules. So local context is really key.
Nada, maybe we can talk about the Middle East a little bit more. I mean, we've seen the adoption of certain principles, or at least a lot of interest in similar sort of EU-led pieces of legislation like GDPR in the region. What do you think about what's come out of the Digital Services Act, Online Safety Bill in terms of content moderation in a region that is often viewed as particularly challenging when it comes to these cultural and religious elements?
And just as a form of background for everyone here, for about the past 4 years, I have been engaging several governments in the Middle East and North Africa around data protection laws. And, their first drafts were clearly pulling in different, copy-paste pieces of the GDPR, similar to some of the cybersecurity policies that we've seen. And that's not a bad thing. There are elements from the DSA and the Online Safety Bill, similar to the GDPR, that can be pulled in and then nuanced or fit into the local context. But sometimes the first iterations and the first efforts don't necessarily take into account the regulatory tapestry that's already existing in the jurisdictions in question. And so consultation after consultation, it becomes a debate, okay, how does this piece of legislation fit into the others, and what is missing actually in this tapestry that we need to follow on with, not just from a policy perspective, but like I said, it is a toolbox. There are multiple policies, codes of conduct, voluntary pieces of guidelines that help address content moderation broadly. So I come from that perspective. I've been doing this for about 4 years. It's been fun. But I already see the same thing probably happening, or already is happening right now. So in Saudi last week, a very interesting policy came out around safe harbor. It's literally called the Safe Harbor Law. And it's basically a law that's trying to provide exemptions to intermediary liability. So to the likes of Google, in which cases is Google not liable for content that's posted on its platform. Now this law is now in a public consultation. Industries representatives have an opportunity to engage and provide feedback. It's not perfect. It actually follows a new certification process, so it would essentially mean that platforms need a new certification on top of all other compliance requirements. But it does show that again, governments are tuning in to what's happening worldwide, obviously to what's happening in the EU, UK, and they're testing out. They're trying to see what makes sense within their context, what makes sense within their jurisdictions. And I think that's a step forward. I think it's a very positive development. So yeah, that's the first example that comes to mind within the Middle East.
And just on that safe harbour, is that a way of, a way for regulators to sort of shun some of their responsibility, or give a means for platforms to squirrel out of some of these things?
I mean, it's a valid thought. I do think that, along with transparency, the second element that was common within our answers has been accountability. And I think within the activity of moderating content, we need to actively seek out the roles and responsibilities of governments, of platforms, and of users, because not a single one is responsible alone of ensuring people are safe online and are able to express their views and opinions. Now that, again, the line between the two, it differs from one country to another. It also differs from 1 year to another, from today to in 5 years. That will change. But I think as part of the debate, transparency and accountability is what we're trying to achieve through these regulations. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Actually, if I may come in a little bit, I mean, I think this is kind of quite similar to what a lot of the digital rights people are fighting with the Section 230 of the U.S. Communications Act, which protects these platforms from liability. And when you look at that in the context of what has happened to content moderators in Kenya, who wanted to be able to have a right to sue a particular platform for being liable for how they were treated as content moderators, it kind of gets us into this position where we are stuck, literally, right? So while it might be interesting to have these safe harbors, what has continuously happened is that the platforms have remained very extractive in their engagement with these markets, because it's better for them to be in a country where they are protected than in a country where they would have to face liability when such things happen. So we'll have to continue to watch the case of the content moderators in Kenya and how they succeed being able to get the big blue to be liable for what happened during their tenure there. But I think we have to learn. These are opportunities and moments for us to learn and go back to just basic humanity. That, what happened to the young people in Kenya was quite atrocious. And I don't think that any of us would ever agree that, there should be blanket shield to a company that, benefited financially from the abuse of young people in that way. And this was in the context of content moderation, interestingly. So it just kind of goes to show that we are still struggling with finding the right formula, and it's not a one-size-fits-all. But in general, I think I'm very much opposed to these blanket shielding of companies from being liable, especially when they are providing content or providing services in a jurisdiction where they have not been required to register and be responsible. I think the best example another example I can give you is in the form of the shared rider model that we have now. We've got one particular one that is not registered in any of our countries, but is registered in Estonia. And both Kenya and South Africa have had trouble where women have actually been assaulted by their drivers, or something even worse has happened to passengers. But the company is not registered as a transport company. It's a tech company. It's not even registered in the country, and we have no recourse. There's some serious safety issues that are not just only in the online bubble, but they find the way. I mean, online threats find the way to physical danger for most people, and I think we have to be very careful around that.
Nada, anything from your side on this subject?
I mean, the only thing that I would add, and it's probably a conversation for another time, is that, like I said, no one has a solution, and we're trying out different models. And I think, one item or one element that hasn't been covered even here in the EU-UK front is how are we protecting the moderators themselves? not just those that are, working within the platforms, but the moderators that are outsourced, the third parties. What mechanisms are we putting in place to ensure that there's a limit on the content that they go through every single day, alongside the AI, which we'll cover later, but what do we have in place to protect them? I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing, a lot of frameworks and risk assessments and codes of conduct that are super helpful in how we define the key taxonomy and terminology within the debate of content moderation. But there's just so much more that we can do, and I genuinely want, and I hope to see, countries within the emerging markets bubble, the Middle East in particular. I do want to see, new ways of thinking and new policy tools being developed there. I don't see anything preventing that from happening. So there are, like I said, things to pick up from what's happening in this part of the world. There's a lot that we can learn, but I think we can contribute, and I think the world should contribute to this discussion as much as possible.
Maybe, Annika, on what we've been discussing in India. I mean, India is one, case example, but it happens in a number of African countries, particularly around elections and, those sorts of political events. But where you have a country or an environment where the policymakers or the government are actually acting in this sort of, what we would define as less than best practice way, is there an opportunity for, say, civil society actors and the broader stakeholder group to engage more with online platforms to strengthen that relationship, to overcome somewhat the influence of government in this instance? Because from where I sit, the decision that's in front of some of these companies is, if we can't protect our staff, should we be in the market? But at the same time, we're serving a broader purpose. We are delivering content, we are delivering news that may not be there. So it's a difficult decision. So is there opportunity for civil society groups to get more engaged?
Yes, certainly. I mean, there's been a lot of engagement between civil society and several platforms actually in the continent around specifically these issues of moderation. And moderation not just only for content, but I think for Africa in particular, it's also around language diversity as well, right? Which we have completely forgotten. We're a continent where there is a growing user gap. But when you look at most of the content that we want people to get online to read, it's not even the majority of the continent does not speak English. Yet majority of the content remains in English. There's obviously a lot of effort that's been made around translation now, but civil society has very much been involved in some of those. But also there's been another level we've seen in South Africa in particular around public interest litigation led by civil society, where they have taken these cases to courts. In fact, we've had a ruling from the Western Cape High Court that addressed what was happening on one of the platforms, is that women were going on the platforms to basically talk about the abuse they were experiencing and naming the people who were metering the abuse, and got slapped with defamation of character lawsuits, and Twitter took down their account, and this was an anonymous account. And so literally we've had a case now where a Twitter handle was the applicant in court, which was quite interesting, because here you have a group of young women who had to stay away from school because they had experienced sexual violation, but the men who were responsible for the violation continued to go to school because the school said, they are innocent until proven guilty, but if you are uncomfortable being in the same space with them, you stay at home while they continue to get an education. So of course, we believe that this internet is the equalizer, right? Don't we all? So they went online and they did a name and shame thing where they came up with a list. It was called the RU reference list. So they called the reference list hashtag, and found themselves with a lot of lawsuits of defamation of character. But what was interesting is that they exposed these men through an anonymous handle, and the women themselves were anonymous, but the men knew exactly which woman to go and sue, and also to sue the handle. So we were in court defending a hashtag handle, that had been taken down by Twitter. By the time the ruling comes, and of course the women won, and the court was very clear that this is a form of silencing, and they should be able to share their lived experience online, right? But by then, the platform had already made a decision to moderate by taking them off completely. So we are not getting it right. We are going to get it wrong a lot, I think, before we get it right. But perhaps there's also a role for the courts, so civil society has been willing to use public interest litigation as a way to get us passage where we are stuck. Is that the best way? I don't necessarily think so. But right now, where there is an impasse and an urgent matter, the courts have been willing to go there.
Interesting. I'm not sure if you saw the New York Times yesterday, but there was an interesting editorial from, and I apologize for my pronunciation, but Yael Roth, the ex-head of safety for Twitter, and talking about his personal experience and effectively the attacks that he faced from Trump when he was in the White House, but also, Elon Musk more recently. And it's really interesting, to see how, from his perspective, he posits that there's a concerted campaign by the right, to target, people with leftist or more left-leaning views. I mean, he was doing his job, as you mentioned, Saad, in the sense of there was I think this was related to something that Trump mentioned, and there was a note on the tweet saying, click here to find out more information about postal votes or something like that. And I mean, he's talking about the personal impact on his life. He's had to relocate his family. This is still an ongoing impact for him. And I mean, he says that he feels that, platforms are reacting now to government in the sense of, really pulling back from where in the past they've made these very strong claims about, ethics and morals and content, protection, etc., to really now protecting themselves to some extent from litigation or from, concerted, personal attacks.
I think going back to what Annika said earlier, I think it's important to take, like you always say, a step back and really look at, the situation, the case study that you provided, and if we're talking about hundreds of people texting someone very aggressive, terrifying messages, we need to also think about why and how are people seeing a piece of news and reacting in this way. Are they being provided with the right tools from school onwards to be able to process information and critically think for themselves in order to make a well thought through opinion on a subject? And I think that's another role that governments need to play. Obviously, in addition to all of the tools that we've been discussing here today, education is such a key feature. And one example, I think I did mention it to my esteemed colleagues here the other day, is Finland. I think we have a lot to learn from Finland. They have the highest rate of combating misinformation because every single topic presented or discussed or provided within a very young age and within the curricula, each professor has to adapt in the mathematics session, in the geography, history, philosophy sessions, essentially snippets of news or videos. It could be a TikTok, and they get the students to think, well, what is my opinion about this, and what am I basing my opinion on? What more research do I need to do in order to come up with my opinion or a conclusion on how I feel about this piece of content? So I think, to address even more at the root of the issue, we need to make sure that kids are equipped with that ability to critically think through, what am I watching, what am I seeing, and how do I feel about it, so that when they grow up into a world that's even more digitized than today, which is, both exciting and terrifying, are we able to provide a safer environment?
Is there any provision for that in South Africa or the African, economies at this point?
Not really. I think what I'm hearing here is also that some of these challenges may be happening online, yes, but they're not different than what happens in society in general. So if we have contentious we have not figured out how we negotiate our coexistence in a city, in a town. I mean, I think for me, coming from Johannesburg and South Africa in general, our whole entire history has been about us arguing with each other as fellow citizens, right? And how that is encouraged, managed, is going to be an exact reflection of what you see and what we do online. When we have a tour with the KOTs, the Kenyans online on Twitter, it's a reflection of our society. And I think what Nana was just saying is so important, that we have to invest in offline solutions as well. It's not going to all come from digital, because this is really a reflection of our socio-economic inequalities. So look at even the bills that we have that exist now. Most countries have a hate crimes bill. How is the existing hate crimes bill that's pre-tech informing hate speech online today? What has been the adjustment around digitizing the rules that already exist? We recently had an incident where South Africa is always spoken about as having one of the best cyber crimes bills that was passed in 2019, which is wonderful. But it's problematic in so many ways that, so we have this great bill that criminalizes revenge porn, as an example, and actually uses these words, revenge pornography. Then just last year, we have a member of parliament who experiences having a video leaked of her and creates such huge discourse online. And the police don't know what they're supposed to do. It's the citizens who are saying, arrest this man, and the police are saying, oh, she must come and open a case. In which act must that happen? Because your very act says this is a crime and you are law enforcement. So there's a whole society perspective that we have missed in some of how we are adopting these acts, implementing some of this. I often say to people when they say their jobs are going to go away because we are now using machines, I often ask them, so when we used to park at a parking lot, there used to be a man who is in a box, right? And we would pay our money when we exit. Now there's a machine that we go to, we put our ticket in and we go out. So there's been an evolution of the role of parking lot attendant naturally. So it's not new. How did we adjust from that, or the cash register who was using a calculator to check us out, to the one who's using automatic exit? How are we adjusting? But we're not doing that with the laws, which is really unfortunate, because it's still, online is just a platform, but it's still the same players that are talking to each other, that are using hate speech against each other. So if we've grown up being told that we have a freedom of speech, but we can't yell fire in a crowded room, how are we translating those limits? Because that's a limitation on freedom of speech, by the way. That you have a freedom of speech, but you can't just scream fire and get everyone running out of here. So how are we, it's a limitation on the freedom of speech. How are we now applying that analog limitation into our digital spaces? And I think that's really where we need to be.
I think I have a very funny, mention here, and then I'll make a point. But speaking of the New York Times, there's a really funny video. It's about 4 minutes long if you're interested to watch it. And it's about this concept. Apparently it's a thing. It's called sharenting. And it's about parents sharing their kids' content without their consent. Now, without getting too much into like how do we get consent from the kids, I think we shouldn't underestimate how the new generation is going to react to all of this, and how they are putting in place in their own homes certain mechanisms and certain discussions and debates around what can be shared and what cannot be shared and why. And I think these conversations should be taken at home. I think they should be taken very seriously. And I think they will be shaping how we approach content moderation moving forward. But more importantly, the point that I wanted to make is that what really gets government going is facts and figures. We know this. And I think that there's a huge lack in terms of the research available out there that is tailored to specific regions, specific markets, of the actual impact of bad content management and bad content moderation policies. And why does that matter? Well, in this video, it literally says that in the US, sharenting is going to be the cause of 2/3 of identity thefts by 2030. And when you put that in like a 4-minute video, well, you're going to get a lot of people really worrying about, wait, did I share too much myself? Did I post a picture with somehow a name or an address in the background, or even my house? And you start really thinking about the content that you're sharing. And again, you go back home and you have these conversations and you make sure that you do it responsibly. So I think there's a lot of things to discuss through this panel.
And it's a Pandora's box for sure. Annika?
Yeah, so I think AI is definitely going to be a game changer in terms of some of the cases that we've seen with what happens to content moderators themselves. So, but I think we should always see it as assistive, because most of the issues that we are moderating for, they are really human social issues for the most part in terms of the content that is presently online. And I don't think it can be 100% done through AI. I think you need to kind of have a duplicate system where you still have local people doing that. But I think the part that I want to actually also contribute to is the fact that we have to begin to see the developing countries not only as content consumers, but begin to invest in a content economy where they are innovators as well. And I think that's really where we are going to start seeing a bit of a shift around some of the difficulties and issues that we are having around content itself that's online. We've really missed an opportunity to invest in the content economy that is driven by some of these emerging markets. And, so I've often argued that the same way that we are driving connectivity, we need to also be driving the demand side of connectivity. And right now, a content economy is that demand side, and we need to diversify where the content is coming from. So Africans are not just consumers online, but they have an opportunity to be developers online, so that we can begin to also see less of this kind of conflict that we are experiencing right now around this push and pull on content moderation.
Great. And last but not least, Nada.
So I won't sit here and pretend to be an AI expert. We've had a beautiful input from Saad here, and other than the fact that we need to make sure that the data that's being pulled into these new solutions and services are not biased in themselves and they're labeled properly, and that we make sure that there are audits in place, that algorithms are reviewed on a regular basis, and there's always someone in the loop, but that person is also protected from a mental health perspective. All of that, I'm sure that you are all aware of these things. I think one thing that I do want to pick up on is the question of monoculture. And to your point, Annika, the fact that digital platforms, online space is just a reflection of society, and it's obviously sometimes a very dark reflection, because terrifying things happen when someone is behind a screen and is able to completely hide away their identity. But I think we need to make sure that we understand that monoculture is an issue worldwide. It's not just something that is a risk in the emerging markets or in the global south. I think I speak from the perspective of someone that's lived about 9 countries, and I do have very conflicting opinions depending on the topic at hand, depending on the dinner and who's at the table. But I have to admit that even here in the heart of London, I do sometimes find myself not saying my full opinion because of concern over whether the person in front of me is going to understand that it's just an alternative view, it's just an alternative opinion. And again, are they able to understand the concept of strong opinion loosely held, in the sense of, I have a strong opinion now, I can argue to it, I can stand by it, but if you present to me even more valid arguments, they're loosely held. Why not? I might change my opinion. I might do some research and get into this. So monoculture is a risk. It's an issue. It is a grave concern. And back to the topic of AI, we need to avoid that being replicated in even more scary fashion, right? But I'll keep it to that because I can see Lucas just like.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Questions from the audience? This one over here. Thank you. If you could also introduce yourself and where
Yeah,
you're from,
sure.
that would be great.
My name is Hakim Taz from Nexus Horizon. We do trust and safety stuff. So anyway, thank you very much. It's really insightful what you mentioned. I would like just to hear your thoughts on where you see policy or policy development moving forward in the next years. Will it be global, and that should be the model, or it should be take a more regional approach, which of course will impact content moderation and all of that?
Any
In
other
terms of
additions?
trend, so just to directly answer your question, I do think that we are moving more and more towards self-regulation, so a lot more responsibilities being put on the platforms, rightfully or wrongly. And again, these regulations, I mean, I'm not talking about the EU, UK, I am talking about the emerging market side of the debate here. But I agree with Saad in terms of there are core principles like non-discrimination, privacy. These are things that I think we can all agree on, both government and private sector, and we will see those, having similar language defined in similar ways, just like we've seen for GDPR and the data protection laws that came out of that, just as we've seen in terms of the cybersecurity frameworks and regulations that have popped up around the world. But I think there always has to be room for local interpretation and nuance. And I think I would welcome, for instance, Google and other platforms to have Jew-specific community guidelines that maybe don't go into the nitty-gritty of like market-to-market differences, but that do have a sort of geographical scope and nuance in terms of the languages there, in terms of the political norms and the social values, and what is the region and the countries in question looking for. And I think we will be seeing a lot more regulations come up based on my experience in the global south and emerging markets. It's just a question of what are governments trying to get out of them? Are they trying to monetize licensing, or are they really, concerned over user safety? So I think, my day-to-day job is to actually facilitate those conversations and debates, and making sure that, intentions are communicated and that policies move towards a common ground for companies to flourish and to gain more, gain access into new markets, which is great, but also for, local users, people on the ground, being fully aware of how to use these platforms, what are their channels to, dispute any decision made about them, what if they want to take someone to court, what is the legal proceeding that they have available to them. All of these things need to be clear, and they have to be either enshrined in policies, or again voluntary guidelines, codes of conduct. But we really need to get governments going in terms of thinking what is the right fix and what is the right mix for them.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to our panel.
Thank you.